plunge of silence, like ice snapping beneath a soul. The bell slams the dawn sharp, accusatory, lancing through the brittle hush. That single tone pulses through snow-crusted timber and frozen earth, wrenching the widow from restless sleep, into a world afraid to breathe. A brittle dawn breaks over snow-crusted huts, breath drifting in pale wisps like ghosts along the frozen air. Here, buried under a blanket of white, the bell's echo is both summons and sentence. Her fingers, numb with frost, clutch a moth-eaten cloak as she steps into a world paused between life and oblivion. Snow mutely hides her footsteps, yet cannot silence the distant coughs of fever-stricken neighbors, nor the wind's low whistle creeping through shuttered doors. This is a hollow lull, a prelude to grief. Through her ragged steps, we traverse a village sealed by terror. Doorways are adorned with quints and rudimentary wards against a plague unseen. A sour stench of spilled ale clings to the packed mud. Rotting straw, once comforting children, now reek with death's promise. The sacristan's clay holy water bubbles, rancid in whispered defiance. The grindstone lies still, the blacksmith's iron hammer resigned to frost. Her world's rituals have turned bitter, mocking. She pauses before the church nave. Within, a lone candle burns, its smoke rising like a fragile heartbeat. Once, she kneaded dough with her children for feast hearth, warmed, sustenance baked. With hope now, she scans the grey light through narrow windows, thinking of that ritual buried in famine and fear. She breathes in the acrid candle smoke, tasting desperation. At night, she sets beside her bed a rusted key, its iron bitten with age, its weight measured with hope. It stands as a promise of sanctuary, a home she can no longer open, for grief has claimed it by dawn. She moves to the frosted window, her palm pressed to glass etched with veins of ice. Outside, dark birds, ravens, or crows dance across ash-grey skies, their wings painting omens of movement, of hunger, of reckoning. She watches as the bell tolls once more low, unrelenting for someone she loved. The sound resonates deep within her, digging into marrow and memory. Beneath that toll, we hear the heartbeat of history. The plague's onset varied across villages. Some lost 70% of their kin in mere months, but here, each toll narrows their world further. The air remains taut, wound by fear so dense it crackles. She breathes shallow now, recalling lessons learned in the dead of night, that infection spread in sleepless hours, when sweat mingled with breath and black blisters feasted on flesh within days. She remembers the first scourge of cough and fever, aggressive, unstoppable. It ripped through villages like a war without soldiers. No one was spared. Peasants and priests alike met the same fate. Fear of the unknown compounded grief, she thought. The church could shelter them until priests walled families inside homes to die. Now, the church's threshold is fragile, its doors heavy with dread. She retreats from the window, the candle guttering behind her, its smoke merging with morning. Mist. Her breath forms a steady mist before her, warmth battling cold. Around her, the village exhales a world of fragile walls and fragile hope. In her mind, lines of straw bale surface, burial pits, trenches dug in haste, bodies layered in cold. Earth because consecrated ground ran out within weeks. She felt the weight of earth dropping onto shivering coffins, smelled the rot as do thawed bodies half buried. She heard the grunts of villagers forced into burial squads, their hands numb with grief and cold. A memory surfaces, a child's cry muffled beneath a damp shroud. A mother's scream as a son's fever claims him, and the widow, once comforter, now comforted only by bone-chilled wind and distant bell toll. Her prayers, once communal, now echo in empty nave, unanswered as the sun rises imperceptibly. The snowfall continues, crystals settling on rooftops like ash, as if heaven mourned too. The widow steps outside. The snow yields under her, boots with a sorrowful sigh. Frost cracks beneath each step. Light seeps through ash-grey clouds, but it tastes hollow. She pauses at the edge of earthen path leading beyond the villaged award fields, untended. Mills stopped, forests seized. By hush, that path holds stories not yet told, of famine, of flight, of cruel choices made in kitchens where only vinegar and porridge remained, of those who fled to distant towns only to be passed at checkpoints, their blood-stained cloaks smeared. With quarantine pots of vinegar, a low wind lifts and lays down scattered straw. It feels like a sigh. She clutches her cloak, draws it tighter, feeling its worn threads graze against her cheek. Her rusted key swings at her cider talisman, heavy with absence. Tethered to a home now unreachable, she glances once more at the bell tower where the tolling continues slow. A countdown. Behind it lies the heart of the village's grief. Ahead lies whatever lies beyond these snow-silent streets. She turns, stepping onto that path. The snow hushes around her, now still save for the scrape of her boots. The bell toll fades into the drone of wind across empty fields. Her silhouette falls into the white horizon. The screen would hold on that frozen figure of lone survivor striding into isolation, hope as fragile as frost. And in the hush, the question emerges: where does the living go when death claims their world? A storm of distant footsteps echoes behind shuttered doors, body collectors pressing through frozen streets, shrouded in coarse cloth, tipped with vinegar, dragging bodies from snow-filled huts. Each footfall cracks frozen earth, each cloth wrapped, former promise broken. The widow, newly sworn to the road beyond her home, stops. She watches the procession, hushed, methodical, grief-laden. Their task is merciless, yet tender, gathering the dead for mass graves carved into frozen earth. The air is thick with the earthy stench of rot and fire smoke from disinfecting piles of clothing. The world tilts further. These are no rites of passage, but expedients. A bitter surrender to numbers. In the distance, the church tower stands, silent, its bells idle. Not even death merits their call now. Across Europe, communities have fallen into patterns of group burial. At Thornton Abbey in Lincolnshire, nearly 50 villagers, men, women, children were laid side by side in a single trench, their bodies carefully shrouded and aligned as if in prayer. Their silence lies thick beneath the soil, a testament to grim devotion amid collapse. In cities like Ragusa, Dalmatians attempted solutions. In 1377, merchants arriving by sea were held on isolated islands Mercan or Cavitat for 30 days before entering the city, a primitive quarantine born of necessity. Here too, villagers begin to seal themselves in, nailing boards over doors, draping thresholds in herbs, or stacking stones to seal infection inside. Fear becomes architecture. Our widow's senses change in the wind. She remembers towns on trade routes, the cursed ships leaving the Crimea for Messina, carrying rats and their fleas, poisoning port after port. That same wind now lifts snow from the pits, carrying with it pollen-dry scents of vinegar baths, and burning rosemary symbols of failed cleansings. In the pit, The clay pots of sour porridge stand cold. Body collectors, trembling, work through layers of bodies. She imagines their hands red with blood and earth-binding shrouds, knotting limbs, closing lids. Once, funerals were luminous candles, chants, the weight of cloth gliding across. Coffins. Now, those rituals are washed away. No friends, no priests, no last absolution. A child's toy, broken wooden peg rests half buried beside a woman's shawl. The widow reaches out but draws back. A chasm stands between reverence and danger. She breathes, her chest cold with grief, in the gathering dusk. She follows the trail of stray smoke toward the hall where the quarantine is imposed. A huddle of villagers stands by a wooden barrier. They exchange pails of vinegar water and broken bread. Distrust glimmers in their eyes. A priest clutches rosary beads but does not move forward. A doctor in stained robes shrinks back. No one dares enter or claim the dying. Disease has redefined the boundaries of mercy. Isolation is its ruthless theology. The widow recalls the day. Priests bricked up an entire family alive with the plague, leaving them to endure or die in silent darkness. Faith has not fled, but its practices have hardened into fear. The widow steps around a broken gate, entering a courtyard of ice and weeds. She feels the weight of absence, empty ovens, unshuttered pipes dripping into frozen basins, the hush of tools long neglected. Harvests lie uncollected, fields retreat under snow. The economy is stillborn, farms lie empty, livestock thin, abandoned. The grip of plague is not only on bodies, it is on the land, the hearth, the very breath of existence. A bell rings thinly from the chapel. Someone alive must have dared to push the clapper. It is a tremor of resolve in a body of despair. The widow turns her face upward. Flakes of snow slide down her lashes. Her lips move in a prayer, not for the dead, but for the living. She takes the rusted key from her cloak, holds it out in her palm. It feels wrong now, not a reminder of what was, but a broken vow. The key drops to the frozen earth. It sinks into snow, swallowed by white. In releasing it, she chooses the living path ahead. Night gathers around her like a blanket of ash. She lifts a frozen twig, breaks it. The snap cracks the silence, and with it, the chapter closes. She walks toward distant lights, faint but alive. A candle, a lantern, a hearth still fighting. Ahead lies the next chapter, survival beyond death, where quarantine becomes creed. Sacrifice becomes solidarity, and the living must find new ways to cling to hope beneath an endless winter. A restless wind sighs through half-collapsed cottages and abandoned fields, an unseen pulse in the quiet aftermath. The widow's silhouette stands on the ridge above the village, shoulders heavy yet unbowed, watching smoke drift from distant chimneys, signs of life stirring once more in a world bruised by loss. In the distance, bell towers, once silent, now toll again but differently, not to mourn the dead, but to summon the living. It is Eastertide of 1349, months since the first wave of the Black Death. Entire villages lie empty. Others cling on by skin and bone. The widow descends toward a nearby hamlet, each breath tasting of thaw and promise, her heartbeat echoing in her ears like a cautious hymn of survival. She passes fields left fallow, where frost-cracked soil still bears the memory of famine and fever. The wind carries a sharp tang of melting snow and pine resin, the scent of a world stirring from its long nightmare. Along the lane, farmhouses reveal signs of reluctant rebirth. shutters pried open. A thin plume of smoke, a broken plough blade used again to gouge muddy furrows. She arrives at a half-formed barn, where survivors with gaunt faces and reddened hands haul sacks of seed. Their voices waver between relief and sorrow. Their labor has become more precious than any coin. Across England and Western Europe, wages climbed sharply as labor dwindled. A shift felt in the marrow of every handshake and harvest share. Inside the barn's rough-hewn doorway stands a midwife and healer her, skirt soaked with mud, apron pinned with rosemary and chamomile. She meets the widow's gaze. In their silence, they share nights spent gathering death sweat shrouds. Midnight prayers murmured over still bodies, the ache of unanswered prayers. Yet here they are, fragile blossoms rising from a field scorched by death within the communal hall. Pine benches hold the tools of recovery, ledger books detailing debts forgiven. New hires writing their names of women now recognized in contracts once concealed in silence. Here, on this rough flooring, men negotiate freedom from serfdom. Land leases reworked into copyholds, agreements penned on parchment rather than bound by status. The widow steps outside as a bell ring heralds midday. Sunlight breaks through. Leaden clouds, illuminating hopeful gestures, hands clasped in prayer. Seeds pressed into thawed mud, contracts inked in trembling scrawls. She senses a fragile triumph weaving its threads across this land, earned by endurance, yet unsteady. Yet, the peace is uneasy. Beyond the barn, lords fret. Land is cheap, labor expensive. King Edward's ordinance and Parliament's statute of laborers aim to reverse the tide-fixing wages to pre-plague rates, condemning wanderers as vagrants. Wikipedia +3, Wikipedia +3, Wikipedia +3. These laws cling to power even as survivors assert theirs. The widow recalls stories of landlords hiring field hands at unheard wages, levying fines on those who dared demand more projects. iq.harvard.edu. Change has come, but resistance stirs. She walks among stocks and piles of grain, noticing faded seals on grain sacks, once staples of in-kind wages, now increasingly replaced by cold cash, glittering in new pockets. LSE. The transition is tentative. The old order yields, but fear lingers in tightened purse strings and wary glances. Parchment lies between them and subsistence, contracts woven from hope and compromise. The widow holds a small pouch of coin-stamped silver, heavy in her palm. It used to mean little. Now it feels like both currency and weapon. Each clink echoes with unspoken tension between merchant, laborer, lord, and peasant. She imagines those same coins leading to revolt villagers, marching on manors, demanding rights. As whispers grow of what Tyler's coming rebellion half a generation hence, night begins to settle. Lanterns glow faintly at doorways, their golden arcs bidding caution. The widow lowers her gaze to the churned mud beneath her feet, footprints of workers heading home, unsteady but determined. Their breath, in fragile clouds, carries glimpses of new purpose. She stares at the horizon, where sky meets thawing fields that may feed families again. In the hush before darkness deepens, she hears a distant murmur: contract, negotiations, peasants declaring their freedom, a bailiff's bark of refusal, a lord's anger tempered by necessity. Somewhere, a quill scratches parchment. A widow signs her name as proof her body still has value, her labor a claim to belonging. She touches the purse of coins at her waist. her palm feels its weight. Here stands the new covenant. Survival no longer bound solely to birth, but to bargaining, to labor, to law. Yet the road ahead is riddled with suspicion of laws breaking bonds, of elites tightening reins, of peasants rebelling with fire in their eyes. The widow steps away, her footsteps quiet but purposeful. Smoke-tinged dusk swallows her figure. The communal lights fade behind her. Ahead lies the uncertain crucible, rebuilding trust in fractured systems, defining the edges of freedom, testing whether this fragile revival can withstand both winters, return and power's backlash. As her silhouette recedes into gathering darkness, the scene softens into candlelight on rough-hewn walls beyond. We sense what comes next, seeds of revolt swaying in shaky hands, the forging of new rural communities, and legal battles that will shape who may live and who must labor. The chapter closes with her figure melting into the night, but leaving behind the echo of a single question: can this ember of renewal endure, or will it be snuffed out by old hierarchies and new upheavals? A distant thunder rolls not of storm, but of hooves and voices drumming across thawed earth where frozen stillness once reigned. The widow stands beneath a bare tree, its branches skeletal against a slate sky. Beneath her boots, shards of ice crackle, echoing the way words can fracture fragile peace. Ahead lies the market cross, now thronged by wandering laborers, their eyes wary, their breaths ragged dot in the gloom. Penniless men and women clutch tattered sacks, seeking work wherever it shows. After the Black Death's fury, labor is scarce, and precious, the harvest fields must be sown once more, barns repaired, carts mended. Survival hinges on the reawakening of the land. Yet an unseen chain binds these workers' edicts, born in distant halls, weighing on each breath and each laboring hand. King Edward's voice echoes from parchment sealed with royal wax, the ordinance of laborers in 1349, followed by the Statute of Laborers in 1351. These laws forbid laborers to demand wages above pre-plague levels, mandate work for those able-bodied, and punish wandering hands. The statute binds the poor to fields and masters once more, forbidding them from seeking their worth. The widow knows this weight. She watches a man coaxing coin from a lord, only to be hauled into the manor's reeve's yard when he dares ask for fairer pay. A woman in the crowd weeps, her wages meager, her debt heavy. She remembers how wages once surged after plague, and how inflation followed. Vinegar and loathing fill taverns as laborers recount the injustices of intervention. A breeze lifts the widow's hood as she recalls the first run-ins with law enforcers known as justices of laborers. They patrol fields, armed with writs and fines, rooting out idlers and returning them to servitude. Across England, courts record laborers, punished women forced back to land, men jailed or fined for demanding too much from cruel masters. In one courtyard, she witnesses a tense encounter, a bailiff reading from a parchment, commanding a man to return to service at fixed wage. The field hand's trembling hands grip a single shilling, his market worth, yanked away, his dignity fractured. He bows his head, voice gone. The bailiff slams the parchment shutter, verdict echoing through bones, and yet rumor stirs in shadowed taverns and at hedge meets, whispers of Wat Tyler's rebellion yet to come, of uprisings that will shake London's towers and scatter the seeds of a new order. The widow senses the shift like distant tremors. Words on lips, free wages, no fixed servitude, justice for the flesh and sweat of hands. She walks on, passing fields where seed is sown into furrows still damp with thaw. She steps into one where women kneel to press wheat grain into soil. There, fingertips tremble, their hearts ache. This land, once cursed by plague, now offers promise, but only if they dare to claim it. Elsewhere, their peers have vanished into the north, into towns, into exile, only to return with wounds and stories, but also coins earned by free labor. The widow lingers by a barn door, its wood scarred and patched. A man emerges, carrying a sack. They lock eyes. For a heartbeat their stories merge. Both survivors, both bound, one by law, one by grief. She nods, placing a silent pledge between them to tread forward and not be tethered. As dusk strikes, a hoarding storm bell rings. From the village chapel, calling villagers not to mass, but to debate. A meeting is called under the cross, voices rising. Some argue for obedience. Law is king, king is God. Others chant quietly, quoting John Ball's sermon. When Adam delved in Eve's span, who was then the gentleman, the widow steps toward the gathering, cloak brushing against packed earth. Her key lies bound at her belt, no longer rusted trinket, but symbol of choice reclaimed. She will listen, she will witness, she will weigh whether this ember of revolt is flame or folly. The wind surges, flakes of ashlight snow swirl like ghosts of the past. Hands rise, faces hardened by frost and plague. A debt ledger is thrown into fire. A bell rings again, tolling for death, but rallying for change. Her silhouette merges with the crowd, resolute, unknowing, alive in purpose. The camera would close in on her face, illuminated by lantern light, eyes reflecting embers of hope, fear, determination. Around her, voices swell as night folds over earth. The chapter closes on that lantern glow, the widow standing at the edge of rebellion. Ahead lies the tinder of revolt, the crucible of justice, and the looming clash between crown and common. The next chapter awaits. London on fire, leaders emerging, banners torn in wind and the widow's place in a world remade by both law and defiance. A distant roar rises against London's wall shouts, the clang of steel on stone, the thud of hooves directed at wooden gates. The widow stands at the fringes of the city, cloak tangled in mud, breath ragged with anticipation. Smoke curls above the battlements. London immovable and ancient is trembling. Earlier that day, the Kentish and Essex rebels, led by Wat Tyler, burst through the open gates. Swords and axes, drawn an army not of knights, but of labourers and artisans, united in fury and hope. They stormed the Tower of London, freeing prisoners, seizing the hated records of poll taxes, swaying hearts by torchlight. The young King Richard II retreats into the White Tower, clutching the iron of sovereignty, but trembling beneath it all. A hush falls on the widow as she watches banners wave high roar. Banners stitched with longing for justice. Faces she could name only days before appear battle-worn. Eyes aflame with the memory of sweat and the promise of flames. In the belly of this city, she feels the weight of collective rage. This is not simple, Reatit is reckoning. Amid the tumult, the priest John Ball speaks words like drumbeats in the crowd. When Adam delved in Eve's span, who was then the gentleman? A question that cleaves back centuries even. The buildings lean in to hear Zincreed. She hears it in her bones, a truth corroding the power structures. Labor is lineage. Worth is born in work, not blood. The camera would fix on her face as the crowd surges past, the The tower breached, the mayor's records burned, rods of authority shattered. A figure appears. Wat Tyler towering, fierce, voice hoarse with conviction. He demands the king's ear. Knights kneel in fear. Londoners cheer, their voices braided with chants of freedom. For one heartbeat, the kingdom trembles toward a new dawn, but dawn betrays promise. At Smithfield, Tyler meets the king on June 15th. The widow sees the flash of steel Sir William Walworth plunging blade into Tyler's flesh, watched by the teenage sovereign historic. The rebel's eyes widen defiance, unextinguished even in betrayal. The crowd gasps, then roars. Royal soldiers swarm. Tyler falls, his head soon raised above them like a dark omen. The widow shudders, her breath cracking like old wood. The bell of London tolls not for death now, but for order restored. The rebellion fractures, its fire swallowed by steel and oath. Richard's voice rings out. You shall have no captain but me, historic royal palaces. For now, the uprising collapses into ash. Night descends. The widow steps through chaotic streets, where rebel caravans disband in fear, men and women swallowed by dark alleys. Fires are doused, crates of grain reclaimed, proclamations trailing in the haze. She halts at a hastily chalked list of names. John Ball's among them, condemned to die. A hush follows her footstep as she pictures Ball preaching at Blackheath. His words a hammer on class, a spark that ignited the city. She passes the tower's gate, where Walworth stands triumphant, steel-stained and pride sharpened. Around him, soldiers drag rebel survivors toward courts and gallows. Many will never return home. Their bodies will hang as symbols. Their families left uncounted in the winter of forgetting. The widow feels the key at her belt, once symbol of sanctuary, then of choice, now of burden. She opens her fingers. Snow drifts into her palm. It melts, leaving rivulets of cold and loss. She tucks the key into her cloak and moves on. Tomorrow, the king will revoke promises. Tax records will be restored, orders will tighten. Executions will spread beyond London into Essex, Kent, Norfolk, numbering in the hundreds rebels hunted as traitors. But deeper still, wages will slowly climb. Serfdom will weaken over decades, not by statute, but by the stubborn bone of rebellion. The widow threads through alleys, slick with melting snow, and fetid warmth of bonfires, gruences of survival bound. In communal sweat, lantern light glints on torn banners, freedom's ragged edge. She treads toward the Thames, whose black ripple will swallow bodies and secrets alike. Ahead lies her next chapter, returning to the countryside where embers of revolt smolder, where survivors shape new laws, where whispers of freedom face lords. Repression, her journey once more, fragments from unity to solitude, from city fire to village frost. She pauses on the riverbank. The city behind her bleeds candlelight. Above, the moon glimmers through smoke and ash. Her silhouette is still, but her heart beats anew, hardened by fire, yet flickering with hope. The steel tip of the night wind carries her forward. As the river flows past her feet, she steps into the current of change, bearing sorrow, memory, and a promise she cannot yet define. The chapter closes on that step, exile by water, but not by spirit, a journey from rebellion's heart into the long winter of rebirth and reckoning. Moonlight drapes the countryside in silence, painting skeletal fences and furrowed soil in silver. Yet beneath this fragile calm, distant thunder of wagons and voices, whispers of change. The widow walks along the beaten track that leads from London's walls back toward her native fields, footsteps echoing in her chest like a heartbeat renewed after near death. Gone are the orderless crowds of rebellion, now replaced by hired wagons laden with seed, tools, and whispered hope. She lifts her gaze to cottages, shutters broken, others bright with lit hearths, and she senses the tremor of transformation. This is England's new world, rising from upheaval into uncertainty. The bones of serfdom are cracking in the flicker of watchfires. She meets women of renewed agency, widows, who now sign their own names, not crosses on tenancy agreements. Wives who advance as household heads with hard-won authoritarian advantage of labor shortages created by the plague and purged further by revolt. Recent studies show that mortality reduced the peasant workforce so drastically the feudal system itself began collapsing, and villagers now negotiate terms once inconceivable. The widow enters a hall warmed by hearth and hope. Gaunt laborers recount finally earning doubled wages, recorded not in traditional dues, but in coin. This shift in economic power has been so large, it even forced Parliament to freeze wages to pre-plague rates under the Statute of Labourers. But in practice, it failed. Farm wages doubled between 1350 and 1450 despite the law. She listens as a farmer signs an agreement in copyhold. Rent paid in money, not labor. Freedom earned through coin, not servitude. The feudal bonds are fraying. She recalls the spring of 1381 when John Ball preached, when Adam delved and Eve span. A rallying cry whose echo still coils through these hills. The widow steps outside into dusk. A wind carries the distant bleat of sheep landowners shifting to pasture, enclosing common sowing discontent for future centuries, but today sowing wealth and autonomy for workers. This creeping change is both blessing and wound. Opportunities bloom where access to land endures, but for every flocked hillside, rights are lost elsewhere. She treads toward a boundary stoner, former common green, now edged by thorn alongside. It, a group of villagers gathers, men and women bound in shared perseverance. They plan a fair wage contract, a communal mill, a petition to their lord. Their eyes are determined, haunted by remembered death, fire, and silence, but illuminated with cautious conviction. The widow draws her cloak around her, as if shielding herself from memory's haze. She holds the rusted key tightly no longer. Relic but symbol of a past watched, a future unlocked by necessity and defiance. Beneath her hand, the metal has warmed, bearing the imprint of hope and survival. Far above, a church spire stabs the night sky. It has seen plague, revolt, suppression, but now it stands witness to something new. Not renewal, but resistance. A people no longer invisible, rising with purpose. Around that spire, bonfires of scandalized faith give way to quiet vigils. Anti-clerical anger still simmers, but so too does a longing for personal communion and communal justice, flame lit by black deaths, primal fear and fanned by revolt's embers. The widow begins to walk the village lane homeward, yet changed. Her silhouette pulls into the final lantern glow at a cottage door. A neighbor comes out, offering a bowl of broth, simple nourishment, but now seasoned with equality. They exchange no words. Their smiles say all that survives, resilience born. From shared scars, night deepens. The star-pale sky settles above as she enters her hearth walls still, but the embers are crackling again. Fear and faith have untangled in the fabric of this community. She places the rusted key upon a new wooden table, no longer to lock, but to set down what was, so that something else can grow. The key glints in corner candlelighter, marker of both loss and liberation. The camera would pull back to show windows glowing across frosted fields, voices muted in promise. Outside, the boundaries of commons and enclosures lie etched in snow. The widow, seated by the hearth, clasps her hands, feeling in her bones the shift, seeds planted in both earth and in rites. The chapter closes on that close of hand and hearthlight, drawing us into the next Cena world where the struggle is no longer for survival alone, but for justice, remembrance, and the fragile equilibrium between lords and laborers. The question remains, can this emerging order hold, or will enclosure, economy, and entrenched hierarchies extinguish the ember of rebellion? A grey morning spreads across the commons where children once raced and fields were shared. The widow walks along furrowed earth, now scarred by stakes and fences' straight lines that cleave land once held in common. The wind rattles wooden posts, like spectral hands pushing her onward into this new landscape. Behind her, the echo of open fields, where sheep and cattle once grazed, freely has died. She pauses by a boundary stone etched with fresh letters, its inscription naming the owner, not the village. Here begins the private realm. The wooden rails, laced with wire, block her path, as though staking claim over sun, soil, and breath. Frost lingers in the ditch, a reminder that winter is never far. But what chills deeper is the hush. The fields no longer welcome voices. They demand obedience. Enclosure has come, not as invitation, but decree. Lords of the manor have petitioned Parliament, invoking acts of centuries past enclosure acts that legalize theft from common right. These enclosures stretch back to Tudor times, but now, in the wake of plague and revolt, they surge forward. With relentless logic efficiency, agrarian innovation, profit, more than 5,000 acts will follow by the 18th century, snatching away fields meant for sheep, kinney hearths, and children's play. Along the fence line, once rich pasture stands divided into tidy paddocks. The barns behind them hum with activity. A tenant farmer loads a cart with turnips and barley into sacks sealed with his family seal. Convertible husbandry planting clover, turnips, rotating crop yields, promise of bounty. But that yield comes at cost. The laborer stands empty-handed outside the rails, his livelihood cut and claiming only the wage assigned by law or charity. The widow steps inside a yard where a wealthy lord's agent counts coins, bloated profits, yanked from newly private plots. The widow's palms itch at the rusted key still in her pocket, one symbol of both home and choice. Now it clinks against the immigrant's shilling, a token no longer exchanged, but crushed beneath market law. Further down, a motley procession of villagers, some landless laborers, others smallholders, walks toward the town. They carry simple geese-roasted tins of broth, wrapped in cloth. Their shoes bear scuffs, feet bear weight of resignation. Behind their steps, the open field disappears, replaced by ordered rows of wheat and sheep. Some leave for wool workshops. In towns, some set sail for distant Ireland or Calais, where land awaits those who had none. Many are lost. At midday, the widow enters the manorial corten oak panelled hall where enclosures are rubber-stamped. The reeve reads aloud the act. The common is no more. Compensation is offered. A small plot, poor in soil, not worth the toil. The widow sees tears masked by pride as tenants bow before the Lord. Some name themselves in ink, others with crosses. The widow watches the agent hand coins for cottager, plodsify for survival, not freedom. She tastes copper on her tongue. She steps out into a wind sharpened by corporate fields, passing commoners who've lost turf and fuel, wood gathering now forbidden, peat piles burned or sold off. The old ladies who once sold firewood are now silent, their livelihoods removed as sure as their access to warmth. Enclosures strip far more than land, they strip rights, identity, autonomy. Yet, amid the grey, a stubborn blossom persists. Altars, men and women gathering in secret at village green before sunset. They distribute seeds saved from before. They pass around lime and manure not as profit, but as survival, as craft, as legacy. They speak of petitioning the reeve, appealing to common law, hiring scribes, pooling coin to challenge enclosures. Their whispers prick at the order of fences. The widow kneels at the fence line, tracing her fingers across its wood. She feels the grain knots and grooves once hidden beneath familiar fields. She presses her palm deeper into its roughness, as if touching fate. She closes her eyes and breathes, cold but resolute. Somewhere in that gathering of smallholders lies a chance to hold the ember of community. Community that persisted even through plague and revolt. At dusk, lantern light fires up candlelit windows in cottages built on newly allocated plots. The widow steps into one. Inside, a woman with loosening grey hair stirs porridge spiced with wild herbs gathered by families barred from old commons. The aroma is faint offering, but enough. The widow lifts a bowl, its steam curling against her face like an offered reconciliation between past and future. They sit across a rough table, two women more bonded than title or land, their words a prayer and a plan. They speak not of revolt, but of petition, of petitioning Parliament to let them access common woods for fuel, of teaching children reading so they can argue law. Their debate is quiet rebellion. Claim knowledge, claim rights, demand justice. Within fences, dot out on the fields, dusk yields to moonlight. The widow returns to the fence line. She fits her rusted key around a narrow gate. This key had once opened doors and choice. Now it turns the latch to a new domain. She steps through, planting her boot upon an open plot. She folds her hands, closes her eyes, and offers thanks for soil, survival, and solidarity. The camera would retreat slowly, across fences stitched into earth, across lantern-lit cottages, across smallholders gathered in candlelight. The widow stands in the foreground, clasping the key, the rust red clear under moon's glow. This moment is neither triumph nor defeat, it is endurance. Enclosure is itself a revolution, from shared fields to private plots, from duty to contract, from serfdom to laboring citizen, and yet resilience lives in women who sew, in villagers who speak law, in memories kept alive beyond fence and act. The chapter closes on the widow's silhouette under the moon, facing both fence and freedom. The key rests heavy in her palm, a token not of a locked past, but of doors to open a journey not yet complete. Ahead lies the dawn of modernity, boundaries drawn not by blood, but by ink and coin. The next chapter awaits, industrial whispers, stirring cities, rural traditions pressed into exile, and a world hurtling toward change forged in both frost and fire. A muted dawn breaks through soot-dark windows in a cramped lodging house. Inside, the widow wakes to the rasp of looms and the scent of damp cloth. a gentle industry replacing the hush of empty fields. Her fingers once raw from frost now, trace threads spun from wool, fine and coarse, dyed in dim pots where smoke and dye swirl like ancient alchemy. She stands on a narrow or a street in a burgeoning town or place where the common pasture has given way to workshops, where men and women converge in clusters of labor and necessity. The bell of the merchant's hall rings, not for church, but for shift change, signaling yet another day in a life wrenched from the soil. In this moment, the world tilts again, away from fields, toward the loom, the workshop, the dense fabric of trade. Through her eyes, we enter a weaving hall alive with clatter, shuttles flicking, frames creaking, women calling counts, men hauling bales of wool. Wool weaving had surged since 1400, turning towns like Exeter and the Cotswolds into centers of export. The trade swelling from nearly zero to tens of thousands of cloths each year by mid-15th century. Here labor is measured in threads, contracts, guild dues, blurring the old relationships between crown and peasant, tenant and overlord. She remembers the village wind that ripped at fences. But here wind is harnessed. Fulling mills throb water power to cleanse, beat and finish cloth. Women's voices rise in verse-like cadence, half song, half prayer, melding tradition with necessity. Their fingers shape fortunes, weaving not only textiles but fortunes. Men in London manage up to 80% of exports, pulling this region into European trade. Yet life here is tight rooms crammed, walls thin. The widow shares hearth space with weavers, journeymen, widows like herself. They barter work for shelter and share broth thick with barley and onion. It smells of soot and hope. Old rites of pasture and wood are distant memory. Now, every coin counts, and every stitch demands skill. The world demands compliance, not survival. In the evening, guild officers stride by, inspecting wares and weighing wool standards. Guilds born in post-plague wanderings serve as new benefactors and gatekeepers. They impose rules, enforce quality, yet offer protection. Labor is reshaped into craft, yet craft is chained to dues and masters' favor. The widow watches apprentice girls and boys learning to spin. Their eyes hopeful or hollow. Is this upward or onward, or merely another bind? In a back alley, she finds a small meeting. Villagers turned artisans, charting futures beyond feudal bonds. They sign guild rolls, petition councils for charters, pooling coin to repair roads, hire scribes, register freedoms. Through this, labor migrates, weaving political wills into the early steam of civic governance. The Black Death and revolts cleared fields and fences. Now cloth, trade, law, and town become the next loom. At night, she returns to a garret above a workshop, the hush broken by distant laughter, the soft fall of midnight wool. She holds her rusted keet, no longer opens rural door, but now unclasps. Something in her chest. Transformation, unbidden, unwelcome, yet real. Her fingertips feel the grain of wood, the weight of metal, the pressure of her story shifting from soil to stitch. Before she sleeps, she writes her name on parchment, no cross, but full letters next to the mark of a guild, an imprint of belonging, voice given form. The loom's creak is lullaby. The candles gutter a metronome for change. The chapter closes on her silhouette in lantern light, hand raised to seal a contract. Decision made not from heritage, but choice, testimony, defiance. The key glints by the door, untethered, ready for the next threshold, toward cities deeper, trade's engines louder, and the forging of a society spun from plagues, ashes, revolts, embers, and craft's enduring thread. A hesitant dawn filters through soot-smeared windows in a narrow draper's lane. The widow's breath catches in the dim light as the sharp click of loom shuttles begins an urgent staccato that replaces the village bell's toll. Steam rises from dye vats, staining the air with pungent earth and alkali. Here, where cloth is currency, labor is bound by thread and contract. She traverses the workshop floor, pressed bodies working in choreographed tension, threads stretched taut on beams overhead. Wool bales are shuffled as if loaded with more than fibers. Guild masters stride among them, measuring length, counting hands, inspecting texture. The first trade guilds emerged in 12th century England. By the 14th and 15th centuries, guild halls regulated every aspect of quality, pricing, an apprenticeship no wanderer could sell without their sanction. Yet women walk these aisles. 2 young girls apprenticed at hearths, journeyling, spinning beside looms, and silkwomen trading their narrow wares. Their presence is undeniable. Married, widowed, or unaffiliated, they work in silk, candle making, and dyeing. But membership is limited. Even skilled London silkwomen, those who wove ribbons, braids, buttons, never formed a guild of their own. Instead, they remained a mystery, a shared craft without the formal protections of men's guilds. The widow watches a young silkwoman twisting cords dyed with madder. Her movements are precise, face tranquil in concentration. This is artistry, uncelebrated yet indispensable. A guild officer, gold chain glinting, steps toward them. He inspects the cords, nods, then turns away. A blessing withheld. No entry, no office, only labor. She moves on to a writing table workshop. Here both men and women carve frames, paint scrolls, polish desks. A journey lady woodworker wipes sawdust from her hands. She meets the widow's steady gaze. No triumph, but solidarity shed in callous and need. Guild halls are filled with scent, beeswax from candle makers, linen from silkwomen, resin from coopers. They hammer in languages Latin contracts, oath-swearing, inheritance lines. To be a widow sometimes meant limited inclusion. Women could continue their husband's trade, but often only briefly before statutes stripped them of authority. Here, the widow's rusted key rattles in her pocket, not to open doors, but as memory, warning, talisman. She steps outside into dust-whipped streets, where carts rumble with wool bales bound for the steelyard Hanseatic. Merchants potent, agent in London's wool economy, foreign tongues mingle with English. Contracts are weighed in wax and measured in Flemish. The widow senses how democracy of wage-labored threads has become. Transnational leverage. Weaving cloth becomes weaving bonds across borders. In the open square, guild banners flutter. Master weavers bear crests, loom blades and bobbins. Women stand at fringes, selling narrow silken wares unsanctioned by contract. They are resourceful, untitled, persistent. She pauses beneath a timber-framed guild hall, its heavy beams carved with vines and symbols, windows tall with dust. Inside lies privilege, ritual, enforcement. Inside, apprentices swear fealty, journeymen pay dues, masters debate fines for undercutters. Outside, silkwomen's hands remain uncounted by law, but counted in every braid, every button, every trade. The widow tucks her cloak against cold. She crosses the square toward a candlemaker's stall, where a mother and daughter dip beeswax into molds, murmuring prayers for light. The wax drips like tears of faith and industry. The widow buys one candela, fragile investment, then writes her name on a parchment at a guild scribe's table, no longer cross, but full letters, claiming space not inherited but earned. Her key lies heavy in her palm. It glints not of past thresholds, but of future ones. At dusk, she stands upon the bridge, spanning the Thamus's dark current. In her hand, the candle's flame quivers, sits reflection dancing on water that carries cloth, commerce, and changed lives. The chapter closes on that candle, held aloft against black currents, a signal not of remembrance, but of claim. In this woven world of guilds and gender, authority and exclusion, labor and law, the widow stands, ready to thread her place quietly, steadily on streets shaped by trade and bounded by power. A chill breeze threads through narrow streets at dawn, carrying whispers across timber-framed houses. The widow pauses beneath the carved lintel of a city gate, its stone threshold worn smooth by countless feet. Beyond lies a realm where every glance is measured, every word noted, and every observer might be judge. Surveillance, mutual official, unavoidable, edges in around her, shaping not only what is said, but who dares to speak, behind closed shutters and in public halls. The watchful eyes of town councillors, guild officers, and civic constables hold sway. Their gaze oversaw cloth quality, ensured market scales were true, regulated prices and monitored those who dared cross lines old and new. Medieval towns, once pockets of relative freedom, are tightening, controlled. Surveillance becomes the city's language of power and order. Yet women, long bound by custom, have begun to use these very oversight systems to claim voice and space. Along the guildhall, she glimpses banners of weavers, but crosses into realms still bard records note that 15th century England counted a growing number of women as artisans and traders, milliners, medical practitioners, brewsters, silkwomen, but they often remained mysteries. Without formal guild membership or voting rights, she remembers nights spent trailing magistrates through candlelit courts, hearing the hum of petitions, the rights of a widow to continue her late husband's trade, the lodging permit, the appeal for fair usage of commonwealths. She places a hand on the carved door of the civic registry, a repository of inclusion and exclusion. Her breath echoes, one part fear, one part determination, in a council chamber. The mayor adjusts his robe, then gestures to a parchment. Petitioners gathered hundreds of signatures, among them female names, signatures, not crosses, marks of claim. They challenge enclosure decrees, insist on widows' hearth rights, demand apprenticeship access for their daughters. The civic body listens, but the scales weigh tradition over change. Surveillance is not only about watching, it's about sanction, privilege, obligation. She knows these codes: fines for undocumented trade, orders to remove unauthorized stalls, restrictions on guildless labor. The guild's intimate ties to municipal power mean every unsanctioned loom, every unsanctioned voice draws scrutiny. Yet, she also witnesses unexpected solidarity. Vigil of women finds shelter within the guild's shadow. They meet in back rooms, drafting petitions by candlelight, pooling coins for legal assistance, sponsoring choristers for civic ceremonies. Her own rusted key with its weight of memory rests, now on parchment beside their marks. Its metal, a reminder of doors she could open and doors she could forge. The city breathes around her, a living organism of bricks, guild halls, lamplit courts, Surveillance is part of its heartbeat, compliance its method, community its hope. She walks on, past the civic stocks, past a watchman's lantern, past the registry sealed with wax. Each step draws her deeper into the interplay between visibility and agency. In the evening, voices echo through narrow lanes. A mother teaches her daughter the alphabet from a primer proof of literacy and defiance of limits. Nearby, journeymen and journey ladies discuss strategy, apprenticing daughters into crafts, petitioning for women's rights to remain as widows with apprentices, placing their names directly into civic roles. Heard of steps born from plagues, vacuum and revolt's embers. The widow pauses on a small bridge arching over a dark canal. Below, water carries refuse and reflection alike. Above, lanterns glint in ripples. She looks at her reflection, a woman marked by loss, but not broken, shaped by silence, but now seeking voice. She lifts the rusted key to the lantern's glow its shadow, dancing against water and stone. The chapter closes as she steps away from the bridge into the hanging. Lantern light of a civic feaster, feast not of privilege, but of petitioner, gathering where widow voices rise in soft congregation beneath the murmurs of surveillance and the glow of new civic possibility. The next journey awaits in the corridors of power, where law will bend or break, and where the widow's petition may yet tip the scales toward justice for those long overlooked. Dawn seeps through tracery windows in the Guildhall's tall chamber, dust motes drifting like hushed prayers. The widow steps forward, rusted key in hand, her breath steady. Around her, the council's robed figures regard her with curiosities, hopeful, others skeptical. Today, she becomes both petitioner and precedent. The city's heart is cold, stone, and warmer hope, carved by centuries of law. Petitions have long been its lifeblood. Nobles, merchants, even abbesses like Clements of Barking wrote for autonomy and tradition. Now, in a moment both fragile and weighty, the widow's voice joins that line, a widow no longer hidden, but opening the ledger of her community. She offers a simple parchment petitioning in her full name, not a cross requesting right of apprenticeship for a daughter who could inherit neither land nor guild. Around the table, guild masters shift. They come from trades where women rarely spanned or delved without paternal oversight, their mystery denied most benefits. Silkwomen of London still weave apart from guild roles, their labour unregulated but unacknowledged. Yet her petition is both personal and echo of women from poorer towns who petitioned alongside men in Norwich borough courts. A clerk clears his throat. He reads aloud the case of Jane Statham, abducted but restored by royal petition, a precedent that widows need not remain voiceless. He speaks of femme-sole customs, how some towns allowed widowed women control of property, trade, and legal status once reserved for husbands. The widow listens, pulse thrumming in her ears. A guildmaster shifts, pulling sleeves smooth. This is craft, not courtesy. But if she pays dues, trains under master, why withhold? Another frowns. Trades are orderly. Female workers bring questions. The widow's gaze is steady. She recalls nights spent under lamp glow, forging petitions, letters, gathering marks, pooling coins to pay scribes. She carries the weight of other voices whispered in civic corridors. Women, widows, mothers unsung but persistent. Outside the chamber, the city's archways guard their secrets. Surveillance not only from watchmen, but from walls that hold record of every petition, contract, gain or loss, sealed in civic archives. Those records shape power. Petitioners become claimants. Names gain permanence. The widow's ink will not simply mark a page, but shift the city's ledger. Inside, the mayor offers compromise. Apprenticeship, but no voting rights. Membership, but no office. Not a victory, but a foothold. Around her, silent nods. A guild officer jots note states. Dues, duties. Her name underlined among widows, husbands, yeomen. The scribe dips quill. The deed begins. When she exits, a wind crosses the square, rattling shuttered windows and banners. In her hand, the petition trembles, a fragile vessel. On the steps, a group of women greet her. A brewer's widow, a silkwoman, a midwife. Their eyes gleam, shared reprieve, solidarity, belonging. A candlelit vigil awaits tonight in the parish guildwomen gathering to celebrate, to strategize, to carry this ember forward. Night creeps in. Lanterns glow along narrow lanes. The widow pauses beneath the archway, pulling key from cloak. She doesn't unlock a door but presses it to her chest. It pulses there. Memory, loss, and now right. The camera would close in. Her eyes, lit by lantern, hold steady hope and caution beyond the arch. The city watch resumes. The surveyors, the constables, the guild overlords. Surveillance hasn't stopped, but the widow now walks within it with permission, yet under its watchful gaze. Her petition has opened a space, but it is narrow, contested, charged. This moment is neither triumph nor surrender, it is opening. A widow becomes voice, a key becomes claim. A city becomes stage for rights unspoken for centuries. The chapter closes with her silhouette receding into candlelit alley, petition rolled in cloak, resolve firm footsteps echoing the pulse of civic change. In the flicker of the last candle, the widow's silhouette merges with history, her voice, once silent, now echoing through whispered petitions and hidden rights, proof that even the smallest key can unlock vast change.